Good morning, everyone. Hopefully, we've gotten past what happened yesterday. I uploaded that file I did to YouTube. I created an Edpuzzle. I assigned it, posted, went to bed Sunday night thinking everything's all done, and then somehow YouTube deleted the file, which then ultimately deletes the Edpuzzle. So I managed to scramble this yesterday morning and save the MP4 file directly to Edpuzzle, which I'll probably do now. Maybe YouTube is very sensitive to what's going on today, and thought maybe there was something in my lesson. I don't know. So I'll probably do the same thing today and upload this directly to Edpuzzle and avoid YouTube. All right, this is the last section on the civil rights movement. We're going to go to part 3, the political response and its challenges. All right, so let's get started. Now, President Kennedy, John F. Kennedy here, proposed a civil rights law. Here he is in the White House with a number of civil rights leaders, including Dr. King, you see there. After Birmingham, after what Kennedy saw, he wanted an anti-segregation and discrimination law. All right. Now, this is to get support for Kennedy's proposal. Martin Luther King is going to do a march on Washington. Now, so the civil rights leaders are all going to get together with King, and they're going to march to Washington and, to support Kennedy. 200,000 people went to Washington, D.C. This is a famous photograph of Dr. King arm in arm with many other civil rights and religious leaders. And they went to the Lincoln Memorial. Lincoln, of course, being the great emancipator, what fitting place to go. So they crowded the whole mall area in front of the Lincoln Memorial. Now, how crowded did it get? Yeah, you can see here it got very crowded. So there's major crowds there. A lot of people, there were some songs being sung, there were speeches being given, and of course the ultimate speech was Dr. King's speech. This is where he gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. Now I'm going to play that for you. And here's a picture of him giving this speech. Now I'm going to play you this the ending, the last like 3 minutes of the speech here. Again, not very high tech. All right, so let's begin this here.
Tears of thee. Sweet land of liberty of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. And so let freedom ring. From the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring. From the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring from the hiking Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring when they gather. When we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
On a hot day in August 1963.
That was a speech. Now, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, unfortunately, after the March on Washington, later that November in 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson becomes president, and he wants Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill passed. So he uses all his political skills, calls in all his IOUs. He gets enough people to vote for it. So the Civil Rights Act is passed. There he is signing it. You can see right behind him is Dr. King. Now, with the civil rights, the government could step in on voting rights and school segregation cases, prevent discrimination in public areas, motels, restaurants, theaters, sports arenas, prevent job discrimination. Now, this is going to lead to what is referred to as Freedom Summer. Now, despite the law, many blacks were denied the rights to vote. Many civil rights leaders organized voter registration drives in Mississippi. What the whites would do in power is they would keep blacks from even registering to vote. So if you don't register to vote, you can't vote. So many civil rights leaders went down to Mississippi to try to organize the blacks to get them to vote, to register to vote. Wasn't easy. You know, they would hold up signs and they would be arrested for things like disturbing the peace and being where they shouldn't be, even if it's on the steps of the courthouse. Many Southern whites were angry over the new law. KKK Klansmen intimidated the volunteers that came to register the blacks to vote. How disturbing is this picture? Many of them who came down south, they'd be beaten up. This is one of the civil rights leaders after they're attacked by the Klansmen. They firebombed black churches and homes. And they even murdered some of the volunteers. Now, there's a very famous case where 3 civil rights volunteers, 2 white men, Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner, and 1 black man, James Chaney, drove down from the north to help blacks in this one particular town to register to vote. And shortly after they arrived, they disappeared. It was later discovered that the 3 were murdered by the Klan. And you can see here's their car being pulled out of a swamp where they found it, and they just buried their bodies in a ditch. This murder led to the famous, it was dramatized in a very famous movie, 1980 movie called Mississippi Burning, with Gene Hackman and William Dafoe playing FBI agents investigating the murder. Now we're going to talk about the Selma to Montgomery March. Now, many blacks, as we said, had trouble getting the right to vote. Many in Selma, Alabama, were denied that right. Now, King and other civil rights leaders were going to march from Selma to Montgomery. Now, when they leave the town of Selma, which is under the jurisdiction of the local police, they would have to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which you can see here. We visited here a number of years ago. Now, once you cross the bridge over the Alabama River, you're no longer in Selma, but you're now in the countryside, so no longer under the jurisdiction of the local police department, but under the state police. And that's the problem. On March 7th, 1965, after crossing the bridge in Selma, 600 marchers were attacked by state police. Many are beaten. It's been referred to as Bloody Sunday. They had dogs, they had horses. Interesting enough, that mattress store you see in the background has since been bought by the civil rights, as a civil rights museum. In all, 17 people were hospitalized and 50 were treated for lesser injuries. There are actually monuments placed. I took this picture. We crossed over the bridge. My wife and I walked over it, and they put these monuments that honor and memorialize what happened on Bloody Sunday to many of the people that were leaders in the march. Now, news coverage shocked the nation with horrifying images. Pictures of what we saw before, attacking the black marchers. Now, they organized a second march 2 days later. They had 2,500 people, but because there was a restraining order issued by a judge, they decided to just have a prayer service on the bridge and then go back into Selma. All right, it was been referred to as Turnaround Tuesday because they were waiting for the judge to issue an order that they'd be allowed to do it. But so they wanted to make sure they had everything all set. So they decided not to march on that one. That night, though, a minister in Selma who had come down from the north, a lot of ministers came down to help out, were attacked by some Klan members and later died in a hospital. This shocked everyone. Now, President Johnson put the Alabama National Guard under federal control. And on March 21st, we have the third march. This is the one that actually is successful. The marches are protected by the Army. 25,000 people joined the marchers. It would take 4 days to march from Selma to Montgomery. Everyone just camped out in the fields along the way, and they eventually did make it to Montgomery, where they gave speeches. The governor decided to get out of town, so they went to the steps of the State House, and they gave their speeches. Here we see pictures of them marching on the way. Now, today that route is the Selma to Montgomery National Historic Trail. So you can actually, you could walk it, but if it took 4 days to walk back then, I would probably be better off just to drive. They do have a couple of interpretive centers along the way where you can actually stop in museums and see, and they have exhibits on what they did during the march. All right, so we did drive this. My wife and I went from Selma to Montgomery following the historic route. Got to really watch for those signs because you just make one wrong turn, you're off in the countryside. Now, in response, Johnson got Congress to pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This eliminated all barriers to voting. In just 1 year, 400,000 blacks registered to vote in the South. That was tremendous. Now that we pretty much, I don't want to say we ended civil rights, but with the Voting Rights Act, it really much eliminated a lot of the impediments for blacks voting. But there is the challenge of black power. We're going to talk about this now. The passage of 2 civil rights acts meant enormous progress. Martin Luther King's nonviolent protest worked. But despite this, there was still economic and social discrimination. Many black leaders saw the change as being too slow. Many questioned King's method of nonviolence. They also rejected the idea of integration into white society. There's lots of anger of continuing, lots of anger about injustice, continuing injustice. And as we see, it still goes on today. Now, author James Baldwin wrote about the black experience. He wrote about the damaging effects of segregation in America. One of his first books, Go Tell It on a Mountain, came out, and it was a collection of essays that Baldwin had written on the subject. He wrote a number of other books, Notes of a Native Son, The Fire Next Time, and No Name in the Street. So Baldwin, who actually lived in New York for a while, actually moved to Paris because he felt it was easier for a black man to live in France than it was in the United States. And sadly, in many respects, that was true. Now, another very important person we're going to discuss now is Malcolm X. He was a young black militant leader. He became a minister for the Nation of Islam. They were called Black Muslims. Now, for Malcolm X, the enemy of the Nation of Islam was white society. He won many followers with his fiery speeches, and he spread the idea of black nationalism, a separate identity and racial unity of African Americans. Now later, Malcolm X wanted to work with other civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King, you see here in the photograph, and white Americans to gain racial equality. See, Malcolm X had changed his attitudes after a trip to Mecca, and he was seeing all the races there working together, so he thought that was the best way to do it. Unfortunately, this made enemies among the Nation of Islam, who in 1965 murdered him. He was about to give a speech at the Audubon Ballroom in Manhattan when men rushed the stage with guns and just shot him to death. So, very tragic ending. Now, in 1966, a new militant political party, the Black Panthers, were formed. They were formed by two men, Bobby Seale and Huey Newton. They wanted African Americans to lead their own communities, and they gave rise to the phrase, "Black is beautiful," a slogan to foster racial pride. Now, the civil rights movement had ended legal segregation, but there was still social and economic segregation. Northern cities still had discrimination in housing and jobs. Many blacks were living in rundown ghettos like the South Bronx. There was lots of poverty, lots of frustration. You could see here, the housing conditions were terrible. And this led to riots. We see them going on TV today. What we see on CNN and the news is nothing new. Back in 1964 and 1967, there were many race riots in Los Angeles, Harlem, Philadelphia, Newark, and Jersey City. The worst one, this is actually Philadelphia's North End after one of the riots. The worst was in Watts. That's a section of Los Angeles in 1965. There were 6 days of rioting and burning, which left 34 dead. The National Guard was called in to restore order. Then we had what was referred to as the Long Hot Summer of 1967. There were 159 race riots in cities around the country. 5 days of rioting left 26 dead in Newark, and the New Jersey National Guard had to be called in to patrol the streets of Newark. Unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of this going on today in the news. The civil rights movement did bring political change, though. The number of black political leaders rose by 88%. Black mayors were elected in Newark, Atlanta, Detroit, Los Angeles. The most blacks elected to Congress since Reconstruction. In 1972, Barbara Jordan became the first black elected to the U.S. Congress from Texas since at all in total. So we finally see blacks getting elected to Congress, and this is the first time that's happened since Reconstruction. And it has continued today, as we all do know, that Barack Obama was elected president in 2008. So it did bring some political change. But as we can see what's going on in America today, we still have a ways to go. All right. Well, that ends the civil rights. I hope you got something out of this and a little more understanding of what happened in 1950 and 60. All right. Thank you, and I'll talk to you tomorrow. Bye-bye.